Kideaters vs. Zoo BoyZ, Chapter 2. Who is playing? Having written about these boys' adventures before, we already know Ronald Vincent Moore, or Ronnie, the youngest of the four. He was 11 when they first trespassed into that crazy, abandoned amusement park, and 12 when he entered the prematurely terminated Zoo Island. He was dreading being left in middle school when his other friends moved on to high school within the next year or few years. Ronnie was used to being babied by others, but he was able to write things that others could never capture in a fountain pen, then pour purposefully onto paper. You see, Ronnie actually believed that the obstacles or awkwardness of those who were older, bigger, and taller laid in the fact that the physical distance between their head, heart, and hand was so much too far away from each other, while Ronnie's compact, small-scaled body was not only built with his body parts, arms, legs, limbs, close enough together, but it was equipped with a superhighway straight through his stature, capturing all sights and sounds, right along with other senses needed to develop good senses. The highway contained some exits and on-ramps, but this internal interstate bypassed the paths leading to states of confusion, allowing accurate accounts, but also articulating abstract environments. Descriptive information raced through his eyes, ears, nose, through the crevices of his hemispheres of his brain, making a tunnel through his heart, then down his arm, to his hand, around the fingertips that gripped a pencil, ending up in letters structured into words, constructed into sentences, forged into paragraphs, filling several notebook pages for others to admire. Ronnie alone was the writing force and source of several personal comic books featuring the big dog's feats, the name he and his 3 friends gave themselves, their gang of 4 members only. Everything he and his friends experienced was able to be molded into a convoy that would convey concrete, structured chronicles of their trips, slips, misadventures, and victorious ventures. His friends, family, and even enemies spurred him on, but no one was more inspiring to Ron than one of the 4, Jeremy. Jeremy McRoy, the 13-year-old kid finishing up his middle school years, encouraged Ronnie every step of the way. His very own sister, Karen, was a writer too. Jeremy used up all of his heartening gestures and words to pep up Ronnie, leaving nothing for his older sibling. He couldn't help but often feel like he was caught in the middle, like in the game of keep away. He lived with Karen on one side and Ronnie on the other. They passed inspirational writing and literature right over his head, and it took all he could give to egg them on, occasionally grasping what was thrown his way for him to admire, release, and get ready to grab the next inventive hand-me-down that he himself, somehow right from the start, inspired. When it was just him, Dave, and Ronnie, he was literally in the middle. Now that John joined, he was sharing the middle with Dave. At one end of the spectrum, Ronnie was only 12, and at the other end, John was 15. It was new and interesting. He was no longer trying to keep the peace between two of his friends. John's contribution made a big difference. Jeremy's family had some means of money. Nothing that labeled them as rich, but he did own a few items that the other boys longed to have. The boys were all learning how to take advantage of what others offered without taking it for granted. In their favor, Jeremy shared his materialistic possessions, confirming that the dogs were truly united, one for all four, and all four for one. As with any good, proud Canadian, Jer was kind, courteous, and always apologetic when faced with what he thought was a flaw or failure. He often confused his friends when he would apologize for something that didn't seem all that wrong or offensive to them. He made them smile when he, in his slightly native accent, would say, "Oh, sorry," or when he showed off something he just got, tossing to them the rhetorical question, "Yeah, it's a beauty, eh?" May we never forget how, when he got frustrated by his friend's behavior, he'd exclaim, "Take off, you hosers!" His three American buddies had no idea what a hoser was, but noticed that the linguistic phrase was used mostly toward Dave. Dave Spence, now 14, but still not the oldest, was almost always indifferent and forceful in his opinions. Being a jock of all sports and a jack of trades for most mechanical shop class skills and trades, he often fit the bill as a jackass, and he was proud of it. For him, he knew nothing but several of the For him, he knew nothing but survival of the fittest and being king of the mountain by throwing everyone else down by any means possible. He thought that usually meant he had to be mean. His well-built athletic body offered him opportunities to be feared and respected. However, he was not regularly respectful toward others. He played the role of a strong-armed bully, but if he was on your side and made the team, the team would be so much more stronger than it would be without him. Dave probably owed credit for his harshness to his rough family life. His home environment was, well, it was very weak or poor on both nurture and nature fronts. Sure, there was, is, and probably always will be a debate regarding the oldest philosophical issues within the psych world. Nature simply gives credit to biology, biological nature, including our DNA, genes, physical inheritance, and heredity characteristics are factored in. Dave's personality and strong physical appearance gave him, well, let's just say, bold leverage. And yet still, his particular surroundings loaded his proverbial pockets with violent variables he witnessed being used to knock down certain hurdles and barricades that threatened to keep away selfish desires and addictions. Rather than build walls to guard the heart of those in his household, he saw each and every family member destroy any and all blockades that prevented them from a free entryway towards self-destructive habits. No one was going to be able to cage this boy, telling him what to do or what is right or wrong. Any strategies offered or ordered to him to help him overcome obstacles he immediately rejected before even giving them half a chance, especially if the advice and advance came from an authoritative adult. Perhaps the only way to help Dave help himself is to try the backdoor approach. What I mean by that is, to reach him, it's best to travel down the path of least resistance in order to deliver the tools he needs. Dave was that kind of person who took advice mostly from peers, musicians, athletes, celebrities, and coaches he admired before even listening to what a parent, priest, or parole officer said. For most of his life, he had already engaged in combat with anyone and anything that tried controlling him against his will in any way. The climate he maintained around even his closest teenage friends was always brewing hot and ready to explode. In some ways, this was good for his 3 weaker friends, but also being around a less cynical social environment with people his own age was really good for him too. He was slowly progressing in the right direction as a direct result of seeing how other families functioned, unlike his own, the dysfunctional family he grew up with. If his own family was the only influence in his life, he too was more than likely destined to fail, just as they had in the past. When you're coming of age, it's necessary to learn that a square-shaped personality doesn't fit well into a well-rounded culture unless that pigeonhole is large enough to swallow the square. When encountering different people, places, things, situations, and circumstances, you can learn from others' mistakes as well as adapt good traits that will work in your favor, helping you adapt to the world you live in. On one hand, doctors who lean toward biological psychology tugged and tied Dave's behavioral issues into exclusive genetic and biological influences beyond his control. He was born and raised in the body he was in, so he used what he had. What he had physically was unlike many kids his age. His physique was much more muscular than most kids his age. This trait ran in his family's bloodstream. Even though they were not involved in any particular physical recreation, not one of them dealt with weight issues. They were fit without any attempts at fitness. Without giving it much thought at all, we all work with what we have. One person's earth suit may be better in some ways than in others. Seeing people of all shapes, sizes, tendencies, and temperatures was a proclamation for contrast and comparison. People who knew Dave and his family considered them to be made from a higher quality passed down genetically over the years, as far as their physical health traits were concerned. When you looked closer and took a closer look at his family's emotional, spiritual, psychological, and mental status, that is when you realize that there were more undeniable generational difficulties that were plain to see. When scolding her son for something he did wrong, he'd hear his mom say, "You're just like your father." When his father got frustrated with Dave heard him shout, "You got no discipline. You're just like your mama, boy." As with everyone in the human race, we are all also subject to feeling the pressure, tension, and pull from whatever atmosphere and environment we live in, not just because of our biological genetic influences. Things from without affect us within. Dave was definitely not exempt from that at all. His defiant actions were simply being mimicked, streaming from things he witnessed witnessed with his own eyes since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. His heated temperament always came through, echoing the same angry rhetoric he heard on a daily basis from each and every family member. When things are too hot, we crave cold air, but when things are frozen, we need to be thawed. The kid's home life was exposed to extreme climate changes. The mood of people around him swung hot to cold all the time. He didn't know squat about global warming, but he personally knew what he had to do just to survive another day. Things were never one-sided when it came to Dave, and he was just trying to be on whichever side worked and hopefully won the game being played all around this worthy young man. No matter what side of the debate you're on regarding the whole nature versus nurture philosophy and psychology or psychological view, you too will recognize that Dave had 2 strikes against him. He lived in a bad environment coupled with bad genes handed down from family members with domestic violence, mental health, drug, and alcohol issues. Maybe you could contend or consider that Dave had 3 strikes against him. Strike 1, harsh environment. Strike 2, challenging genetic makeup from his mother's side. Strike 3, hectic genes, also from his dad's gene pool. After all, it was his mom and dad that held long rap sheets records documenting how many times they were in and out of the adult jail located just a few yards from where Dave was detained, forced to live now. His grandparents, great-grandparents, and great-great-grandparents all had run-ins with the law. He was told that one of his uncles was even born in jail. At this point, the future for Dave wasn't looking too bright. There were some sunbeams, though. It was Dave's newly found friend John who helped him understand life just a little better. John showed Dave, not just told him, that who you are because you're born that way and who you are because you lived around adults with confrontational, sometimes hostile lifestyles, presented him with many choices to help him decide who he would or could grow up to be someday. Dave began to see that he could be a rebel of different sorts. One option was to be the opposite of who and what he saw and lived around. He could reject, revolt against the failed attempts to enjoy life through the same means his family opted toward. For the first time ever, he realized that he was renewable, regardless of his family's history. His hope was that opposition would now create opportunities. Dave also taught John a few things that his sheltered friend had no comprehension of. While Dave was very streetwise and lacking in scholastic ability, John was the polar opposite. Dave often laughed at his new friend John, who was book smart but clueless when it came to being street smart. Now in his first year of high school education, Dave was limited to the classes offered in jail. This 4-year jail sentence threatened to take away his 4 years of any actual average high school environment and experience. So John was going to be his tutor, teaching his friends lessons, not just facts found in a book, but by sharing a very small living space that could help develop his friends' true knowledge and some much needed lessons on the facts of life. Although each boy was in a different cell, they attended the county's juvenile jail school classes together. For John Minor, even the simple desire to learn seemed to just come so naturally. John was now 15, a high school student that was supposed to be going to the 11th grade after the summer. While Dave's first instinct was to get into a fist fight, John wanted to figure out how to get along with others who were disruptive. John functioned with what seemed to be some type of inbred knowledge. He even knew that some people spewed out toxins and needed to be avoided altogether. Things he practiced daily seemed like a foreign language to some kids his age. For him, he was just following the examples his family members laid out before him. Without even fully realizing it, he physically looked like his dad, and yet behaved more like his mom, an introvert, thoughtful, kind, and on the quiet side. And dare I even say, sweet? Although this maturing young man moved through life like an ill-fitted alien, he was still very book-smart. No one could take that away from him. He was definitely still shy by nature, often still having that feeling like he didn't belong or fit in. He wished someone could take that away from him. Like a trooper, though, he approached his life as a new convict with a new confidence. That was one thing that he was able to take with him off Zoo Island. Most of all, no one would argue that John's biggest trait, characteristic, and downright gift was being an art nerd. Perhaps that was what made him such a good artist. The past full year, he has been drawing superhero comic-style images of the other boys, not just his closest friends, but every kid in Cell Block C. His flattering drawings made him a fan favorite with everyone. If you asked John how he got along, survived, and kept safe while in the detention center, aka jail, he too would credit his flattering portrayals he shared with both the bashful and the bullies. Somehow his art helped the bashful come out of their shell and the bullies to contain their outward display of violence toward John. Sure, the verbal and physical abuse was misdirected toward other kids at times, but it wasn't something John had to deal with or address. John was learning and growing more and more every day. The penal system didn't stunt his growth. However, it sadly stunned his educational progression. The classes this particular juvie jail were taught by this lady named Mrs. Walrus. As if that name wasn't easy enough to make fun of, all the boys called her Mrs. Walrust. They eventually used it in front of her, saying it just right so it sounded correct to her, but all the boys knew what was implied. She was one of those people who truly believed in their heart that anyone who was in jail, especially as a kid, was not worthy of a good education. The reasoning in her mind sprung from her opinion that everyone in jail didn't want to accomplish or succeed, let alone learn anything. Well, nothing could be further from the truth for many of the young inmates, especially in John's case, along with other children like John. The whole experience itself, being in jail, taught some of them that they were going to need a good education to do more than they had previously done leading up to their arrest. This was a wake-up call for a lot of these convicted kids. The negative environment backfired, telling the children who were willing to listen that they had no choice to be worse or strive to be better than they had been before. It would take effort. They needed all the help they could get. Too many were failing in their academic life because their teacher was failing to truly teach them well. This teach couldn't care less, and it showed. John wondered, why was she even a teacher at all, let alone assigned to teach jailbird education? Even her outward appearance showed signs of being unkept, careless, and neglectful. That, of course, didn't keep the hormone-raging boys from lusting after her anyway. Her character was very shallow, so I need not go into much depth describing her. As far as John was concerned, he still paid attention in class and did all the assigned work, mainly out of obligation. After all, that's what a good student does. That brought another question into John's life. Is it really homework if you can't go home? Regardless, John was thirsty and hungry for knowledge. He knew if he was going to stay on top of and ahead of stupid games the many riddles of life threw at him, he was going to have to somehow read and study more on his own time. John thought to himself, time, doing time. Time is doing me. Well, Johnny boy, there's no time like the present to learn something I was probably taking for granted before I ended up here. Here, there were a very restricted and limited amount of activities and things to do. There were no cell phones allowed in the holding cells. The one television was mounted high above the boys' reach. Although they did receive a good number of network channels, they only had one remote. That was often taken away if any one of them stepped out of line in any way or another. With the lack of entertainment, or because of its absence, John found himself reading and drawing more than he had ever done in his 15 years alive. John's healthy desires were contagious. His curiosity was never completely quenched. It's for this reason why, as I write describing John, I find myself writing about those around him, those with positive living examples John soaked in like a sponge, as well as the negative people in John's life who met face to face with a wall John built himself to keep them out. Perhaps most people's profile of young men in jail would be made up of images from TV and movies depicting typical hoodlums, hooligans, thugs, delinquents that deserve to be in a detention center. But John was living proof that some people can truly learn from their mistakes, change the way they think, alter their behavior, specifically in these highly moldable years. There were some adults who could learn a lot from John. Older, more mature people who came into contact with the four boys in our stories wished they could start all over knowing what they know now. Maturity levels didn't always rise or climb with age. Sometimes the oldest, matured people children see displayed or portrayed some of the most immature characteristics on earth. John personally believed that the experience we have had previously and the ones we're going through now, along with ones still yet to come, are the most vital tools to build good character. Those happenings can be used to help one mature. Perhaps the environment we find ourselves in also affects our decisions and choices. If that's true, these zoo boys were ready to go back to Zoo Island. The island wasn't the issue. It was the Kideaters on that island that they feared, and they preferred to live without experiencing those creatures ever again. Much more can be said about these 4 coming-of-age boys. I personally know each one of them. I'm thrilled to keep in touch and tag along with them, then share their explorations with you. The fact still remains that I will never be able to write as well as young Ronnie, nor draw like John. However, if you're interested in what happens next, you'll have to move on to Chapter 3. The other players in the boys' game of life are just as important, leading them and sometimes misleading them along the way. The best is yet to come, and unfortunately, so is the worst. On to Chapter 3.